The blizzard hit Caldwell, Kansas, without warning on the 23rd of December, 1879, and if Cole Whitaker had been any kind of sensible man, he would have stayed inside the saloon where he belonged instead of walking out into the white mouth of the storm and changing both their lives forever. He had not been looking for anything that night. He had not been looking for company or trouble or the particular shade of dark eyes that would end up living rent-free inside his chest for the rest of his natural days. He had been looking for his horse, which had gotten spooked by the wind and pulled its tie loose from the post out front of the drover's rest, and he had pushed out through the saloon door with his jaw set hard and his boots already crunching on a fresh inch of ice, cursing under his breath at the animal's poor timing. That was when he heard it, not screaming, not crying, something quieter and more frightening than either of those things, a sound like someone trying very hard not to make any sound at all. He turned into the wind, squinting against the sleet that hit his face like handfuls of gravel, and he saw her standing at the corner of the livery, her arms crossed over her chest, and her dark hair plastered flat against her cheeks. She was wearing a cotton dress the color of sage, a shawl so thin it may as well have been a cobweb, and boots that were clearly not her own, 2 sizes too large and flopping at the ankle with every shuddering step she tried to take. She was not moving anywhere with any purpose. She was simply standing there, and the cold was taking her apart piece by piece, and she was letting it because she did not appear to have any better option available. Cole Whitaker did not think. That was the thing he would remember later, and that his friends would tease him about, and that he himself would quietly consider in the long, lamplit evenings that followed. He did not weigh the situation. He did not calculate anything. His hands were at the buttons of his sheepskin-lined coat before his brain had finished processing what his eyes were seeing, and he was crossing the frozen street before he had consciously decided to move, and he was draping that coat around her shoulders with the kind of certainty a man usually reserves for things he has rehearsed 100 times. She flinched. Hard. The kind of flinch that comes from a body that has learned to expect harm from the approach of strangers. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said loudly, because the wind was a living, howling thing between them. "You are turning blue. Take the coat." She looked up at him then, and despite the cold and the dark and the snow stinging his eyes, he saw her face clearly. She was young, perhaps 20, perhaps a year or 2 on either side of that. She had high cheekbones and a strong jaw and eyes so dark they were nearly black, and there was something in them that was not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had lived alongside fear for long enough that they had become neighbors. She pulled the coat tighter around herself. She did not say thank you, which he would later learn was not rudeness, but simply that she was working out which language to speak. Her name was Lena Vasquez, and she had been in Caldwell for approximately 4 hours. She had come up from San Antonio on the back end of a cattle drive, not as a hand, but as a cook's helper, a position she had talked herself into with a combination of nerve and necessity after her employer in San Antonio, a dry goods merchant named Horatio Peck, had decided that her services were no longer required in any capacity. She had no family left in Texas. She had a second cousin somewhere in Colorado, though the address she had was 3 years old and worth less than the paper it was written on. She had $12.40, a small leather bag of belongings, and a constitution that was frankly remarkable given how thoroughly the universe had been conspiring against her. The cattle drive had deposited her in Caldwell along with its dust and its smell and its noise, and the foreman, a decent enough man named Reeves, had paid her what was owed and pointed her toward the town with the kind of vague goodwill that stops short of any actual assistance. She had been trying to find lodging when the blizzard arrived, and the first 2 establishments she had approached had looked at her brown skin and her Mexican name and had found rooms suddenly, mysteriously unavailable. She had not yet tried the 3rd. "Is there somewhere you are meant to be?" Cole asked, because she was still standing in the storm even with his coat on, as if she did not quite know what to do with the shelter now that it had been handed to her. "I am looking for a room," she said. Her English was clear and precise, with an accent that shaped certain words into something that sounded like music. "I have money. The hotel is 2 blocks east," he said. "I will walk with you." She looked at him the way a person looks at a door before they open it, checking for what might be on the other side. "You do not have to do that." "I know it," he said. "Come on." He walked her to the Caldwell Arms, a 2-story building with a lit lamp in the window and a proprietress named Mrs. Aldridge who was, as it turned out, a practical woman who had grown up in a border town and had no patience for the particular kind of foolishness that turned away paying customers on the basis of their names. Lena got her room. Cole waited in the lobby because the cold had gotten into his shirt and was working its way through to his bones, though he did not particularly want to admit this. When she came back downstairs, his coat was still on her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, and she began to take it off. "Keep it tonight," he said, and he was already turning toward the door. "The storm is not done. I have another coat at the boarding house." This was, as a matter of record, not entirely true. He had a canvas jacket that was adequate for October, but was not going to do much for him in a December blizzard in Kansas. He had no idea why he said it. He went back out into the storm and retrieved his horse, which had taken shelter behind the feed store and was entirely fine. And then he rode 3 blocks in the teeth of the worst blizzard Caldwell had seen since 1873, thinking about dark eyes and the particular sound of a voice that shaped English like it was something worth handling carefully. He did not know her name yet. He found out the next morning. The storm broke sometime before dawn, and Caldwell emerged into a world that had been rearranged. Snow stood in drifts against the buildings 4 feet high. The sky was the hard, brilliant blue that only comes after a blizzard has wrung every drop of moisture out of the air, and the cold was dry and absolute, and somehow easier to bear for its clarity. Cole was at the Drover's Rest before 8, because he had a contract with the town marshal to deliver 3 horses to a rancher named Holt out on the Kishom Road, and the storm had put him a day behind already. He was nursing a coffee when the door opened and she walked in. She was wearing his coat. She had the collar turned up and the sleeves were too long on her, but she wore it with a kind of unconscious certainty that made it look like it had always belonged to her. She stopped in the doorway when she saw him, and something moved across her face that he could not name precisely, but that made him put down his coffee cup. "You are the man from last night," she said. "Cole Whitaker," he said. "I deliver horses, mostly." "Lena Vasquez," she said. "I cook, mostly." She sat down across from him because every other seat at the counter was taken, and the waitress brought her coffee without being asked, which said something about either the waitress's efficiency or about Lena's face, which had the kind of authority that tended to produce results without requiring words. "You should have your coat back," Lena said. "I am going to be riding all day," he said. "Movement will keep me warm." "That is not true," she said. "It is 12 degrees outside. Movement will not keep you warm." He laughed. It surprised him, the ease of it, the way it came out without any of the effort that laughter usually cost him these days. He had been on his own for 2 years, since leaving the Army's 6th Cavalry after a 4-year stint that had taken him through Oklahoma Territory and into parts of Texas. He did not care to revisit, and he had forgotten that conversation could feel like this, like something that moved forward rather than circling back around to the same exhausted territory. "Are you looking for work?" he asked, because the idea arrived fully formed and felt immediately right. "Steady work, I mean, not trail work." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of work?" "Charlie Holt, the rancher I am delivering to, lost his cook last month. His wife cannot manage the house and the hands both, not with 4 children and a beef operation. He has been asking around." He paused. "It is honest work, good pay. The Holts are decent people." "How do you know I can cook?" "You said so." "I said mostly." "Can you or can you not?" The corner of her mouth moved, just barely. "I can cook." So it was that Cole Whitaker drove a buckboard loaded with 3 horses, and one woman across 6 miles of frozen Kansas prairie, arriving at the Holt Ranch in the early afternoon of December 24th, 1879. Lena sat beside him on the buckboard seat in his coat and her inadequate boots, watching the land with the focused attention of someone who is trying to learn a new landscape by heart. The prairie in winter was a study in severity, all pale grass and iron sky, the occasional creek line marked by skeletal cottonwoods, the distances so enormous they seemed to swallow sound. "Where are you from?" he asked. "San Antonio," she said. "Before that, a village outside of Monterey. We came north when I was 11. Who is we?" A pause. "My mother and my father. My father died on the road. My mother died 2 years ago." He did not say he was sorry because it always sounded like something people said when they did not know what to say. Instead he said, "It is a long way from Monterey to Caldwell." "Yes," she said, "it is." The Holt Ranch came into view then, a cluster of buildings against the white-gray horizon, smoke rising from 2 chimneys, a barn so large it looked like it had ambitions. 3 dogs came out to meet the buckboard, barking and leaping, and from the house emerged a woman of about 35 with red hair and an expression of someone who has been holding 12 things together simultaneously and is relieved to have one of them resolved. "Mr. Whitaker," said Ellen Holt. "And this must be Lena Vasquez," said Lena, climbing down from the buckboard with her bag and her borrowed coat, and shaking Ellen Holt's hand with a directness that made Ellen blink and then smile. "Can you start tomorrow?" Ellen asked. "I can start now," Lena said. Cole watched her walk into the house with Ellen Holt, and then he looked down at his own hands on the reins, and he noticed that they were cold, and that he did not mind, and that this was possibly the strangest Christmas Eve he had ever spent, and also possibly the best. He came back to deliver the contract paperwork to Charlie Holt 3 days after Christmas, which was honest business, and had nothing to do with whether or not he might happen to see Lena Vasquez in the kitchen window as he rode up the lane, though he did notice, with a clarity that was almost clinical, that she was there. She came out to meet him when he tied his horse, because she had apparently seen him coming down the road and had a reason to speak to him, which was that she had his coat draped over her arm. "It is warmer now," she said. "You should have it back." He looked at the coat. He looked at her. She had flour on her hands and her hair was pinned up but coming loose at one side, and she looked like someone who had found her footing after a long time of searching for it, like the Holt kitchen had settled something in her that the road had disturbed. "What are you going to do in the next blizzard?" he asked. "There is a better coat inside," she said. "Mrs. Holt's husband has extras." "Even so." "Even so what?" He did not have an answer that made logical sense, and he was a man who preferred logical sense, so he said, "Keep it a while longer," and went inside to find Charlie Holt and sign his papers. He came back in January. He came back in January because the Holts ordered a new mare through him, which was business. He came back in February because the mare needed to be checked for a possible tendon issue, which was also business. He came back in March because he happened to be passing by on his way to Wichita, and it was practical to stop and water his horse at a ranch rather than a creek, which was business in the loosest possible definition of the word. Each time, Lena was there. Each time she was wearing his coat. Not always, not when she was inside working, but when she came out to meet him, or when she was gathering wood in the mornings, or when she was walking back from the garden in the early spring when the air was still cold before noon, the coat was on her shoulders. It fit her better now, he thought, or maybe he was just more accustomed to seeing it on her. The sleeves no longer seemed too long. The coat looked like it was exactly where it belonged. They talked. That was what happened between them, before anything else. They talked the way 2 people talk when they have both been largely without good conversation for a long time, and have found each other's company to be a relief. She told him about San Antonio, about the market days and the smell of the river, and the way the missions looked in the early morning light. He told her about the Army years, about Oklahoma Territory, about the way the land changed color by the hour on the Llano Estacado when the sun was moving. She told him about her father, a man named Eduardo who had been a saddle maker and who had wanted to come north because he had heard there was opportunity, and had been right about that but had not lived long enough to collect it. He told her about his father, a man named James who had been a good man and a bad farmer, and had eventually given the farm to Cole's older brother and given Cole $100 and his blessing to go make something of himself, which Cole was still in the process of doing. "Do you like it?" she asked one afternoon in early April when they were sitting on the fence by the horse pasture and the light was coming in long and golden from the west. "Delivering horses." "I like horses," he said. "I like moving. Those are not the same thing as liking the work." "No," he admitted, "but they are enough for now." She considered this. She had a way of receiving information, setting it aside, and coming back to it from a different angle. He had come to recognize this as one of the things he found most interesting about her, the patience of her thinking. "I would like to have my own kitchen someday," she said. "Not working in someone else's, my own. A restaurant. A home," she said simply, and then looked at the horses in the pasture as if she had said too much. He wanted, with a force that surprised him, to say something. He did not yet have the words sorted out, or he was afraid that saying them too soon would be like reaching for a bird before it had decided to trust you. So instead he said, "That seems like a reasonable thing to want," and she nodded, and the evening settled around them, and neither of them moved to go inside. In May, there was an incident. A man came to the Holt Ranch, a man named Deke Ferris who ran a livestock brokerage out of Wichita and had a reputation that traveled ahead of him like a bad smell. He was there ostensibly to discuss purchasing 3 of Charlie Holt's bulls, but he spent the better part of an afternoon being unpleasant to Lena in the particular way that some men in 1880 felt entirely entitled to be, making comments about her background and her cooking that had nothing to do with the quality of either, and everything to do with the fact that he was the kind of man who needed to establish hierarchy the moment he walked into a room. Cole happened to be there that day. He was not supposed to be. He had finished his business with Charlie Holt 2 hours earlier and should have been halfway back to Caldwell. But he had been helping Lena carry supplies from the wagon she had brought back from town, and then he had stayed for coffee, and then Deke Ferris had arrived, and the atmosphere in the kitchen had changed in a way Cole felt in his chest before he understood it intellectually. He came into the kitchen to find Lena standing very still by the stove, while Deke Ferris leaned against the doorframe and talked at her as though she were a piece of furniture that had offended him. Cole looked at her face. She was not afraid. She was containing something considerably hotter than fear, which he recognized because he was starting to feel it himself. "Ferris," Cole said, putting his coffee cup down on the table with a careful, deliberate sound. Ferris turned. He was a large man, broad in the shoulders, with a face that had rearranged itself around years of getting what he wanted. "Whitaker," he said, "this your girl. She is a person," Cole said, "and you are going to speak to her like one." There was a moment, the kind of moment that can go several different directions depending on the character of the people involved. Ferris looked at Cole, and Cole looked back at him with the particular steadiness of someone who spent a significant portion of his adult life being paid to remain calm in uncomfortable situations. And Ferris eventually decided that Charlie Holt's bulls were not worth a scene and pushed off the doorframe and went back outside. Cole stayed in the kitchen for a moment after. Lena turned from the stove, and her expression was something he had not seen on her face before, something softer than her usual composure, something that sat differently in the lines around her eyes. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know it," he said. This was what he always said when she told him he did not have to do things, and it had become a kind of shorthand between them, a way of acknowledging that a thing was done not out of obligation, but out of something else, something that neither of them had yet named out loud. Summer came in across the Kansas plain like something that had made up its mind. The grass turned gold and the sky became enormous, and the heat pressed down on everything with a flat, insistent weight. Cole found reasons to come to the Holt Ranch with a regularity that impressed even himself, given that he was not, by nature, a man who had ever been particularly good at making reasons for anything he did not strictly need to do. He helped Charlie Holt repair the roof of the barn after a hailstorm broke 6 boards loose. He helped string new wire along the south fence after a wandering herd of longhorns from the neighboring property pushed through. He ate at the Holt table with the family 3 or 4 times a month, and Lena sat across from him or sometimes beside him, and the food she cooked was extraordinary, not in a showy way but in a way that felt like it had been made with attention to the particular people eating it, which was, Cole thought, a form of intelligence most people never gave proper credit to. He brought her things, small things. A book of poetry he found in a second-hand shop in Wichita, because she had mentioned once that she had read Whitman and found him interesting. A packet of seeds for a type of Mexican herb she had said she couldn't find locally, because she had mentioned once, offhandedly, that she missed certain flavors that the Kansas pantry did not offer. A pair of boots that actually fit, because he had been in the saddler's shop and had noticed a pair that were the right size and had thought of her, though presenting them had been the most awkward conversation he had had since leaving the army, and she had looked at him for a long, silent moment before accepting them with the kind of dignity that made him feel both better and worse simultaneously. She kept wearing his coat, not always, but enough. In the mornings when the summer was not yet hot, or in the evenings when it cooled fast, or on the days when a storm came through and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, which Kansas did with a casual brutality that impressed even people who were used to it. He had stopped pretending he wanted it back. She had stopped offering. It was in July that Ellen Holt said, with the kind of directness that red-haired women from Iowa seemed to have in particular abundance, "Mr. Whitaker, you are here more often than our own hired hands, and none of them bring my cook boots that fit, so I am going to ask you plainly what your intentions are." Cole was so startled that he nearly dropped his coffee cup, which would have made 2 accidents involving coffee in this story and neither of them his fault. He started. "Because I will tell you," Ellen continued, in a tone that was not unkind but was very clearly not going to stop for his discomfort, that Lena is not a woman who will be impressed by dancing around a subject. She has done a great deal of hard things in her life, and she has absolutely no patience for anything unclear. If you have something to say to her, you ought to say it. Cole looked at Ellen Holt. Ellen Holt looked back at him with the expression of a woman who has watched a thing develop over 7 months and has opinions. "Where is she?" he asked. "Garden," said Ellen. "Go." The garden at the Holt Ranch was behind the house, a productive square of turned earth that Lena had expanded considerably since her arrival, adding the herbs she'd seeded in the spring, along with a tomato patch, and a row of peppers that had no business thriving in Kansas, but were managing it through what Cole could only assume was a combination of Lena's care and sheer stubbornness. She was on her knees in the dirt when he came around the corner of the house, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, pulling weeds with the focused energy she applied to everything. She heard him coming and looked up. Something in his face must have told her this was not a routine visit. She got to her feet and brushed her hands on her apron. She waited. He was not, as previously established, a man who was good at saying things before they were sorted out. But he had been sorting this particular thing out for 7 months, which he felt was enough time to be reasonably confident in the structure of it. "I think about you constantly," he said, which was not the speech he had prepared but was the most accurate sentence he had available. "Every horse I deliver, every road I ride, I am thinking about the next time I am going to be standing in this county, talking to you. I know that you have plans for your own life, and I am not asking you to give any of them up. I am asking if there is any version of your plans that has room in it for me." Lena looked at him for a long time. A meadowlark went off somewhere in the grass beyond the garden fence, 2 clear notes, a pause, and then the complicated cascade of its song. "You have been coming here for 7 months," she said. "Yes." Brought me seeds, yes. And boots, yes. And you once rode out here in a rainstorm to help fix a fence you had no obligation to fix. The fence needed fixing. Cole, yes. I have been thinking about you too, she said, and the way she said it carefully, as if the words were something she was handing over from a considerable height, made his heart do something he did not have good language for. I have been thinking about you quite a lot. I was not sure it was something I should act on. Why not? She looked away at the garden, at the flat horizon beyond it. Because I have been learning my whole life to be careful about what I need, about what I expect. It is not always safe needing things. He understood this in a way that was bone deep, because he had his own version of the same lesson, learned in different circumstances but arriving at the same cautious, defensive posture. He crossed the few feet between them and stood close enough that she would have to look at him, and she did. "I'm not asking you to need me," he said quietly. "I'm just asking if you would like to try." The second meadowlark answered the first somewhere out in the grass. "Yes," she said. "I would like to try." He did not kiss her then. He was acutely aware that they were in the Holt's garden in full view of the kitchen window, behind which Ellen Holt was almost certainly positioned. He smiled instead, and she smiled back, and it was the first time he had seen her smile with the full involvement of her face, and it was so unexpected and so complete that he had to look at his boots for a moment to collect himself. They had dinner with the Holts that evening, and afterward they sat on the porch in the long summer dark and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, about the shapes their lives had taken and the shapes they wanted them to take, about horses and cooking and the territories to the west where neither of them had been, about what a person would need to build something lasting in a place like Kansas, about the fact that the stars in July were different from the stars in December, even though they were the same stars. Or most of them were. He kissed her at last when he was saying goodbye at the gate, quickly and then not quickly, with her hands on the front of his shirt and the summer dark warm around them and the smell of the garden on the air, and it was the best possible conversation either of them had ever had without using any words. He came back 3 days later. He did not, he wanted to say for the record, invent a reason. He simply came because he wanted to, and this felt like enormous progress. The courtship of Cole Whitaker and Lena Vasquez was, by Caldwell standards, both unremarkable and quietly remarkable. It was unremarkable in the sense that two people finding each other in a frontier town was common enough to produce no particular comment. It was quietly remarkable in the sense that the two of them were so obviously, so thoroughly suited to each other that even the Holt's 4 children, who ranged in age from 5 to 13, and had the observation skills common to children living in close quarters with interesting adults, noticed it, and considered it settled before the adults in question had reached that conclusion themselves. The eldest Holt child, a girl named Clara who was 13 and very serious about it, told Lena in August that Mr. Whitaker looked at her the way her father looked at her mother, which was a description of some precision and moved Lena in ways she was not prepared for when delivered by a 13-year-old at the breakfast table. There were complications, because complications are the texture of real life and cannot be edited out. One of them arrived in October in the form of a letter from Cole's older brother, James Jr., in Missouri, who wrote to say that their mother had fallen ill and was not expected to see the winter out, and that Cole's presence was requested if he could manage it. Cole could manage it. He had to. He told Lena the night before he left, sitting in the Holt's front room with the lamp between them and the sound of Kansas wind against the windows, and the look on his face was the particular look of a man who is being pulled in 2 directions and knows that both directions are legitimate and therefore finds neither of them easier. "Go," she said, with no hesitation. "Of course you go. I do not know how long it will take. It takes as long as it takes." She looked at her hands. "Is there anything I can do?" "Keep things," he said, and then shook his head because that was not quite what he meant. "Keep yourself. Just do not go anywhere while I am gone." "Where would I go?" she said, and there was something in it that was almost a joke. which was how he knew she was managing her own feelings about this by wrapping them in practicality, because he had learned this about her. He left the next morning before first light, and Lena stood at the gate in his coat and watched him ride down the lane until the dark and the distance took him. He was gone for 6 weeks. His mother died on the 14th of November, quietly, in the bed she had slept in for 40 years, with Cole and James Jr. both present, which was a mercy. Cole stayed on for a week after the funeral to help James Jr. settle the estate, which was not large but was complicated by their mother's careful records and their father's somewhat less careful ones. And then he rode back to Kansas through the first real cold of the season, stopping to sleep in whatever conditions were available and arriving in Caldwell in the first week of December thinner than he'd left. With 3 weeks of trail dust on him and the particular hollowness behind the eyes that grief produces when a person has not had time to sit still and feel it properly. He did not go to the boarding house first. He went to the Holt Ranch, because it was where he needed to go, because it was where Lena was. She was in the kitchen, which was where she almost always was in the afternoon, and she looked up when he came in the door, and something in her face opened up so completely that he had to stop in the doorway for a moment and just look at it. "You are back," she said. "I am back," he said. She came around the table and took his face in her hands, looking at him the way she looked at things she was trying to understand fully, and whatever she saw apparently satisfied her, because she put her arms around him and held on with the kind of thoroughness that does not leave room for doubt about how much a person has been missed. He put his face in her hair, and the hollow feeling behind his eyes filled in, and he thought, with the calm certainty that comes when something has been true for a long time and is only now being acknowledged, "This is home, not a building, not a county. This." He told her that evening about his mother, all of it. The illness and the dying and the particular strange silence of a house after someone has left it for good. She listened the way she always listened, with her full attention, and she held his hand across the table, and she said things when there were things to say and did not say things when there were not, and he thought he had never been listened to so completely in his entire adult life. "Tell me something," he said when he had talked himself out. "Tell me something good." She thought about it. "The peppers are going to overwinter in the kitchen," she said. "Ellen let me bring 2 plants inside. They should survive to spring." He laughed, and it was the real kind, the kind that starts somewhere below the lungs and has nothing to hold it back. "Something else," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I am glad you are back," she said. "That is the best thing I know right now." He asked Charlie Holt if he could speak privately with him the following week. Charlie Holt was a man of few words and great practicality, and he listened to what Cole had to say with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance, and when Cole finished he said, "About time," and shook Cole's hand, and that was the substance of the conversation. Cole asked Lena to marry him on a Saturday afternoon in December, exactly 1 year after the blizzard, standing in the yard of the Holt Ranch in weather that was cold but was not, thankfully, a blizzard, wearing his canvas jacket and watching her come across the yard in his sheepskin coat with a basket of eggs from the henhouse. He had thought about elaborate approaches and had decided against all of them on the basis that they were not who either of them were, and what he wanted was something honest. He said, "I want you to be my wife, and I want to build you the kitchen you described in a house that belongs to both of us, and I want the rest of our lives to be one long conversation with stopping points for sleep and meals." She set the egg basket down very carefully on the fence post. "Yes," she said, as simply and completely as she had said everything else, and then, "But I am keeping the coat." He looked at her. "What?" "The coat," she said. "I have had it for a year. It is mine." He stood there in the December cold in his inadequate canvas jacket, looking at Lena Vasquez in his sheepskin coat with egg basket and her dark eyes bright, and her chin lifted with a dignity that would have been imperious if it had not been so thoroughly, obviously delighted, and he said, "All right." "All right," she repeated. "It was always yours," he said. "I just did not know it yet." They were married in February of 1881. in the small Lutheran church in Caldwell, Kansas, with Ellen and Charlie Holt as witnesses and all 4 Holt children in attendance. The minister was a man named Reverend Cross, who had performed considerably stranger ceremonies in his time and was entirely comfortable with the straightforward dignity of this one. Lena wore a dress that Ellen Holt had helped her make from blue wool, and Cole wore the suit that he had bought in Wichita specifically for this purpose and had kept pressed for 3 weeks with anxious care. The ceremony was brief and honest, which was exactly right for 2 people who had already done the harder work of understanding each other before they arrived at the altar. Cole had, in the 6 weeks between the proposal and the wedding, been acquiring things. He had purchased 160 acres of land 6 miles east of Caldwell, under the terms of the Homestead Act, which he had researched with the help of the county clerk, a patient man named Dobbins who explained the filing requirements twice without complaint. He had a small house on the property that needed work, and a barn that needed less work, and a well that worked adequately, and the kind of open rolling land that horses were suited to, which was useful because horses were his business. He had also, with some care and considerably more conversation than he was used to having about business decisions, hired a carpenter from Caldwell to frame out a larger kitchen addition to the house, because Lena had described, over the course of many evenings, exactly what a proper kitchen required, and he had paid attention, because he always paid attention to what she said, and he had written down the dimensions and the specifications, and the carpenter had looked at the list and said, "This woman knows what she wants." "She does," said Cole. The house was not finished when they moved into it in March. The kitchen addition was framed but not yet sided, and there were 2 windows in the main bedroom that were waiting on glass, and the porch was a plan rather than a fact. None of this mattered, or rather, it mattered exactly the right amount, which is to say that it was something they were building rather than something they had been handed, and this distinction was important to both of them. Lena walked through every room of the house on the day they moved in, touching the walls, testing the floorboards, looking out the windows at the land with the focused attention she always gave to new landscapes. Cole watched her and waited. "It needs curtains," she said. "I know it. And the stove in the kitchen is not properly leveled. I will need to have someone look at the legs." "All right. And someone has been using the south pasture as a shortcut because there is a path worn through the grass that was not made by deer. I will speak to the neighbors." She turned from the window and looked at him with that expression he had memorized, the one that sat just before a smile that lived in the region around her eyes before it reached her mouth. "It is a good house," she said. He exhaled. "I was hoping you would think so." "I would not have said yes otherwise," she said, and she was teasing him, which was something she did now with a freedom that had not existed in the early months, a freedom that had developed as she had come to understand that he was safe to tease, that she would not lose ground by being light with him, that he would not mistake her ease for disrespect. Spring came to the homestead with the earnest urgency of a Kansas spring, all mud and wind, and then sudden warmth, the grass going green almost overnight, the first wildflowers appearing in the draws and creek bottoms. Lena planted her garden with the serious intention of someone establishing a permanent relationship with the soil, and it was 3 times the size of the Holt garden and considerably better organized. She traded seeds with a neighbor woman named Ruth Hollies, who came over one afternoon in April and stayed for 4 hours, and left with the beginning of a friendship that would last the rest of their lives. Cole ran his horse business from the property, riding out 2 or 3 days a week, and coming home in the evenings to the smell of food and the sound of Lena moving around the kitchen they had built, and the particular quality of a lamplit evening in a place where both people in it have chosen to be there and are aware of the rarity of this circumstance. They argued. Properly sometimes, with the particular heat that comes from 2 people who are both accustomed to being right, and who have enough respect for each other to not simply let things go when they disagree. They argued about money, about whether to expand the herd or wait another year, about whether to take in a second hired hand for the summer, about a business decision Cole made without consulting her that he should have consulted her about and knew it, and apologized for with a completeness that she accepted without using it against him, because this was also who she was. They made up. This part of the story is theirs and not available for transcription, except to say that the making up was always genuine, and that they were both people who understood that being wrong about a thing did not diminish the rest of what they were, and that this understanding was one of the things that made the marriage function. In the summer of 1881, a man from the county land office came to the homestead and told Cole that there was an error in his filing, a surveying discrepancy that put part of the south pasture in dispute with the neighboring property, which was held by a man named Graves who had arrived from Ohio the previous winter, and was, as far as anyone could tell, neither honest nor particularly patient about it. Cole spent 3 months navigating the legal complexity of this, which required several trips to Wichita and the retention of an attorney named Patterson, who was expensive but effective. Lena managed the homestead alone during this period with a competence that impressed even Ruth Hollies, who came to help with the horses twice and returned home both times shaking her head admiringly. The dispute was resolved in Cole's favor in October, on the basis of the original survey documentation that Cole had had the foresight to file in triplicate, and the south pasture remained their south pasture, and Graves took his frustration back to Ohio within the year, and the neighborhood was quieter for it. In November of 1881, Lena told Cole she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen, which was where she told him most things of importance because the kitchen was the center of their house and of their life together in it, and she told him in the morning over coffee, which she had been drinking less of recently though she had not yet said why. He sat with it for a moment, the information, turning it over with the care he gave to important things. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "I am very well." "Are you frightened?" She considered this honestly. "A little." "It is a large thing." "Yes," he said, "it is." He got up from his chair and came around the table and held her, standing up in the middle of the kitchen for a long time, and she put her face against his neck, and outside the kitchen window the November light came in pale and clear over the prairie. "We will manage it," he said. "I know we will," she said. "I was not worried about that part." Their son was born on the 15th of July, 1882, in the bedroom of the homestead with a midwife from Caldwell named Mrs. Pierce, who had brought approximately 200 children into the world and had opinions about the right way to do it. The labor was long and Cole spent most of it in the kitchen being a liability, which Mrs. Pierce addressed by giving him useful tasks that were actually designed to keep him out of the way rather than because they needed doing. The boy was born at 4 in the morning, and Mrs. Pierce brought him into the kitchen wrapped in a white cloth and presented him to Cole with the manner of someone handing over a very consequential document. He was small and red and furiously alive, with a quantity of dark hair that suggested his mother's side and a set of lungs that suggested he had no reservations about being here. "Your wife is doing beautifully," Mrs. Pierce said. "You can go in." Cole went in. Lena was lying back against the pillows with the particular exhaustion of someone who has just done the hardest work of their life, and she looked at Cole when he came in and then at the bundle in his arms and said, "Let me see him." He brought the baby to her and she took him and held him with the confidence of someone who has been handling newborn animals for years and knows that the key is to be sure and gentle simultaneously, and she looked at his face with the expression Cole had seen her use on new things she was learning. "He looks like his grandfather," she said. "Which one?" Cole asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Both of them," she said. "Somehow." They named him Eduardo James, after both of the grandfathers, the saddle maker from Monterey and the bad farmer from Missouri, and called him Eddie, and he grew up on the Kansas homestead with a knowledge of horses that was innate in the way that some skills are, as if the information had been waiting in him all along and only needed the environment to call it out. The coat lived on a hook by the back door. This was its permanent home, understood by everyone in the household. It was not Cole's coat. It had not been Cole's coat for a long time now. It was Lena's coat, and it was used in the mornings and evenings and in the cold months and occasionally in July when a storm came through. And Eddie grew up knowing that his mother's coat was the sheepskin one that was too big for her and had been since before he was born, though the story of how she came to have it was a family story, told at certain intervals, which he found embarrassing at 8 and interesting at 12 and moving at 16. By 1884, Cole had expanded the horse operation to the point that he needed a full-time hand, and he hired a young man named Thomas Webb, who was 20 years old and from Tennessee, and was the best natural horseman Cole had ever encountered outside of himself. Thomas lived in the small bunkroom off the barn and ate most of his meals at the Whitaker table by default, which Lena accommodated without complaint, because she cooked enough for 6 people, whether there were 2 or 12, and always had. By 1885, the homestead had a proper porch on the front of the house, which had been completed to Lena's specifications, with a railing that Cole had put up himself over 2 weekends, and a small outbuilding that functioned as Cole's office, and also as the place where he went when he needed to think something through without an audience, which Lena understood and respected. Their second child, a girl named Clara Rosa, named after Ellen Holt's eldest and Lena's own maternal grandmother, arrived in February of 1885, 3 years after Eddie. She was a quieter baby than her brother had been, watchful with her father's gray eyes and her mother's focused expression, and she grew up to be the most organized person in Sedgwick County, which started to become apparent at approximately age 4 and never changed. By the time Clara was 3 and Eddie was 6, the homestead had taken on the character of an established place. Not grand. The Whitakers were not grand people, but solid, rooted, with the specific quality of somewhere that has been lived in with intention. The garden was extraordinary by local standards, and Lena had begun trading vegetables and herbs with 3 other women in the area, and occasionally selling preserves in Caldwell, which was how the kitchen first acquired the character of a small commercial enterprise, though neither of them called it that yet. The Holts remained important to them. Ellen Holt and Lena visited each other regularly, and Charlie and Cole shared information about land and livestock, with the easy trust of men who have been doing business together for long enough to have earned it. Ellen's Clara, now a serious young woman of 18, had developed her own friendship with Lena that operated independently of the older relationship, built on a shared interest in plants and a shared impatience with the particular small injustices that the prairie life of the 1880s visited on women who had opinions. The injustices were real, and neither Cole nor Lena pretended otherwise. The questions that arose about the validity of their marriage, in a county where some people found the combination of a man like Cole and a woman like Lena to be a comment worth making, were handled by Lena with a dignity so complete that it generally left the commenter with nowhere useful to go. There were people in Caldwell who were pleasant to both of them individually and cooler to them together, and people who were warm regardless, and people who were unpleasant regardless, and the distribution was not so different from anywhere else, though the specific reasons varied. Cole had a conversation once with a man at the feed store that required him to be very specific about his feelings on the subject in language the man could not misunderstand. He came home from it feeling the particular unsatisfied anger that comes from winning a small battle in a large war, and Lena listened to the account of it and then said, with her characteristic precision, "You should not have to fight that battle on my behalf." "I know it," he said, "but I am going to every time." She looked at him. "I know," she said, "I know you are." 1886 was a hard year on the prairie. The summer was brutal and dry, and the cattle market went sideways, and 2 of their neighbors sold their claims and moved on, which was always a sad thing to watch regardless of the economic explanation. Cole lost a third of his horses in a fever outbreak in August, which was a financial blow significant enough to require a difficult conversation with the bank in Caldwell, a conversation that went better than he had feared because he had a good reputation with the banker, and because Lena had spent the previous 2 weeks going through the homestead accounts with the same methodical attention she applied to everything, and had arrived at a plan that demonstrated the operation was viable even with the loss. The banker looked at the accounts Lena had prepared and then looked at Cole and said, "Your wife is a considerable asset." "I am aware of that," Cole said. "They came out of 1886 intact. Thinner, more careful, with a renewed appreciation for the things that were not dependent on market prices or weather. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was the hardest winter the Great Plains had seen in living memory. The cattle industry across the region was devastated. The Whitakers were insulated from the worst of it because Cole had moved earlier in the fall, selling at lower prices rather than gambling on winter, a decision he had made partly on instinct and partly on the advice of Thomas Webb, who had a gift for reading the weather that was almost uncanny. Thomas Webb married, in the spring of 1887, a young woman named Margaret Keene from Wichita, who had been teaching school in Caldwell for 2 years and had opinions as strong as Lena's, and an approach to expressing them that was considerably less subtle. She and Lena became friends with the speed that women sometimes become friends when they recognize in each other an equal, and the 4 of them formed a kind of easy social unit that suited all of them, spending evenings at one house or the other, talking about everything that was happening in the world and in Kansas and in their specific corner of it. The world in 1887 had a great deal happening in it. The railroads were changing everything. The cattle trails were fading as the range was fenced and farmed. Caldwell, which had been one of the great cattle towns of the trail era, was adapting or not adapting depending on the individual, and Cole had been thinking for 2 years about whether the horse business was evolving fast enough to stay ahead of the changes. He talked to Lena about it one evening in September when both children were asleep, and the lamp was low, and the first cool air of autumn was coming in through the open window, the kind of air that carries the smell of grass going dry and something mineral from the earth turning in anticipation of frost. "I am thinking about changing the operation," he said, "adding a training component, trained horses, not just delivered ones. There is a market for horses that can already be worked." She was sewing because her hands were never idle in the evenings, and she looked up from it. "How long would you need to be at home to do that?" "More than now." "Good," she said, and went back to her sewing. He stared at her. "That is your entire response." "That is my entire response," she confirmed. "You have been doing too much riding. The children barely see you Monday through Thursday." He sat with this. "You could have said that sooner." "I am saying it now," she said. "Because now you have given me a practical reason to say it without it sounding like a complaint." He laughed. "Was it a complaint?" "It was an observation," she said, with dignity. "There is a difference." He restructured the business over the following year. The training operation took root with the same stubborn competence that everything on the homestead demonstrated, partly because Cole was extraordinarily good at the work, and partly because Thomas Webb was an equally extraordinary partner in it, and partly because Lena managed the business side of things with a precision that meant they never overextended and never undercharged. By 1889, they had a reputation that reached well beyond Caldwell, and the waiting list for trained horses ran to 6 months. Cole was home 4 days out of 7, on average, which Eddie at age 7 considered entirely insufficient, and Clara at age 4 considered exactly right, because she liked having him in the office where she could bring him problems. The problems Clara brought were always interesting. At 4, they were questions about why things happened, which she asked with a persistence that suggested she would be unsatisfied with partial answers. At 6, they were questions about numbers, because she had discovered that mathematics had consistent rules, which was the kind of discovery that appeals enormously to a certain kind of mind. At 8, she was helping Lena with the account books, not because she was asked to, but because she had identified inefficiencies. Eddie, by contrast, was outside every possible moment, with the horses or with Thomas Webb or ranging across the property, with the kind of freedom that the Kansas prairie permitted boys who knew their land. He was not an academic child in the way his sister was, but he was an extraordinarily observant one, and he had a way with animals that Cole recognized as his own greatest skill, seeing it replicated and amplified in a person who was half his blood. In 1890, Kansas was granted full statehood's elaboration in terms of law and representation, and the changes in the territory continued their complicated progress. The conversation about what would happen to the lands and the peoples who had lived on them before the homesteaders arrived was not a comfortable one, and it was not one that resolved cleanly, and both Cole and Lena were aware of the specific weight of their own position within it. They had built something on land that had not always been available for the building, and they held this awareness without being able to resolve it, which is the condition of most people living in historical moments they did not design. They talked about it. They talked about it with Thomas and Margaret, and with the Holts, and in the evenings after the children were in bed, and they did not arrive at conclusions that satisfied them fully because there were no such conclusions available. They held the discomfort alongside the love and the work and the life, because this is what honest people do. Eddie turned 10 in the summer of 1892, and Cole took him on his first proper delivery trip, 3 days to Wichita and back, just the two of them and the 4 horses they were delivering to a rancher in Cowley County. Eddie was a capable rider by then and an adequate trail companion, which Cole measured by whether the person could be quiet when quiet was called for, and could be fully present when presence was called for. And Eddie managed both, which was more than Cole could say for most adults he had traveled with. They talked on the trail about things that it was somehow easier to discuss with open land around them and horses moving under them than it was inside the walls of the homestead. About what Eddie wanted to do with his life, which Eddie said was horses, immediately, without consideration. About what the country was becoming, and what that meant for people like them. A conversation that Cole tried to approach honestly without overwhelming a 10-year-old. About Cole's own father and his Army years, and the things he had seen in Oklahoma territory that he had not discussed with his children, yet, because they had been too young, and were perhaps still too young, but were approaching the age when the real shape of things ought to be made visible. They came home dusty and easy in each other's company, and Lena watched them come down the lane on their horses and felt something that had no name in English or Spanish that she had found yet. Something that was adjacent to gratitude but larger than that. Something that was about the full sweep of things from the blizzard in December of 1879 to this particular afternoon in August of 1892. The distance traveled, the life accumulated. Cole saw her at the gate and lifted his hand, and she lifted hers, and Eddie waved with both arms like he was signaling a distant landmark. The coat was on her shoulders. It was a warm August afternoon, and she did not need it, and she was wearing it anyway. He had stopped wondering about this years ago, the why of it. He had arrived at understanding it without being able to articulate it, which was sometimes the best you could do with the most important things. The coat was the beginning of them. It was the first thing that had passed between them in either direction, the first gesture, the first proof that he was the kind of person who acted on instinct when instinct pointed toward kindness. She wore it because it was hers, and because it was the beginning, and because she was a person who honored the significant things, whether the world considered them significant or not. In 1893, Clara turned 8, and she had been reading for 4 years and was 3 levels beyond the Caldwell school curriculum, a fact that the school teacher, A patient man named Mr. Harding reported to Lena with the combination of pride and helplessness of someone who has encountered a student they cannot adequately challenge. Lena and Cole drove to Wichita and arranged for Clara to be taught by correspondence from a school there, a program designed for children in outlying areas who required advanced instruction. Clara approached this with the organized ferocity she brought to everything, and within 6 months was doing mathematics that Mr. Harding looked at, and then sat down with the expression of a man confronting something beyond his jurisdiction. Eddie, who was 11, had no particular opinion about mathematics, but had an excellent opinion about the new mare Cole had acquired in the spring. A gray animal of exceptional quality who Eddie had named Silver with a complete lack of originality and a total conviction that it was perfect. He was training her himself, under Thomas Webb's instruction, and the mare was progressing as if she had been waiting her whole life for exactly this level of attention. The homestead in the fall of 1893 was everything that the house and the land and the people in it had been working toward. The garden was mature and productive and well known. The house had been added to twice and had the accumulated character of a place that has been lived in with love. The horses were their business and their pride, and the business was healthy, and the reputation was solid, and the 2 children who moved through it all were competent and curious and sometimes exasperating and entirely, without qualification, wonderful. Cole turned 41 in October of 1893, which he greeted with more equanimity than he had expected, because the decade he had just come through had been so fully lived that he felt the age honestly without resentment. He had not wasted it. He had not spent it building the wrong things or being the wrong person. He had made mistakes, real ones, and had corrected them where correction was possible, and had carried the uncorrectable ones with the appropriate weight. He told Lena this on his birthday, sitting on the porch after the children had gone to bed and Thomas and Margaret had gone home, in the way that he sometimes told her things he would not have said to anyone else. She was in the chair beside him with his coat over her lap, not quite wearing it, and the night was the deep cool of Kansas autumn. "I did not think my life would look like this," he said. "What did you think it would look like?" she asked. "I did not think about it that specifically," he said. "I thought I would keep moving. I thought that was what I was suited for." "You still move," she said. "You just come back. That is the important part," he said, "the coming back." She looked at him in the lamplight from inside that was coming through the window, and her face was the face he had been looking at for 13 years and had never fully stopped noticing, because she was that kind of woman, the kind whose face continues to reveal itself, who does not become familiar in the way that diminishes. "I am glad you came out of that saloon," she said. He looked at her. "Because of the coat. Because of everything," she said. "But the coat first," he laughed. "You still have the coat." "Yes," she said, "I do. Do you suppose you will ever give it back?" "No," she said, with the certainty of someone who has considered the question and arrived at a permanent answer. He shook his head, smiling at the dark prairie beyond the porch. "All right," he said, "all right." In the spring of 1894, Clara was 9 and had been corresponding with the Wichita school for over a year, and she announced at dinner one evening that she intended to go to university. Not in Wichita. In the East, where there were schools that took women, which she had researched with the thoroughness that characterized everything she did, and she had 3 institutions identified and a timeline and a financial estimate that she presented to Cole and Lena with the confidence of someone who has done the work and expects to be taken seriously. Cole looked at Lena. Lena looked at the financial estimate. She asked Clara 2 clarifying questions about the timeline. Clara answered them. Lena looked at Cole. "The numbers are realistic," she said. "I know," he said. "I checked them." "When did you check them?" Clara demanded. "Last week," Cole said. "When you left your notes on the desk in my office." Clara stared at him. "You looked at my notes." "You left them on my desk," he said. "I looked at them the way one looks at things that are on one's desk." Clara appeared to process the question of whether this was a violation. She concluded it was not. "What do you think?" she asked, which was the most important question, and both of them knew it. And she was 9 and already knew how to ask the most important question, which was her mother's doing, in the sense that her mother had always asked the most important question, and Clara had grown up watching it. "I think," Cole said, "that we should start saving specifically for this and revisit when you are 14 or 15. "Why that long?" Clara asked. "Because we want to do it right," Lena said. "Not just well, right." Clara accepted this with the pragmatism of someone who has learned that her parents say what they mean and mean what they say, which is the greatest gift parents can give a child in terms of establishing trust. By 1895, Eddie was 13 and had made clear that the horse training operation was his future, and Cole had begun teaching him the business side along with the animal side, because a man who could work with horses but could not manage a contract or read a balance sheet was only half prepared for the world he was going to have to live in. Eddie was impatient with the accounts but thorough with the animals, and Cole managed this imbalance with the patience he had developed across 2 decades of working with creatures who moved at their own pace. Thomas and Margaret Webb had 2 children of their own by then, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, and the 2 families were bound together in the way of people who have shared enough real difficulties to trust each other completely. Thomas had become Cole's partner in the business in all but the legal documentation, which they formalized in the summer of 1895 with a handshake and a contract that Patterson's old law firm in Wichita drew up, and the operation became the Whitaker and Webb Horse Training Company, which sounded more formal than it was but conveyed the right information to the right people. The coat appeared in the formalization of the business in an indirect way, because on the morning of the signing, Lena came down to breakfast in Cole's coat over her house dress, which she did sometimes in the mornings, and Cole was already at the table, and he looked at her and said, "You are wearing that to Wichita." "I am wearing it to breakfast," she said. "I know the difference." Eddie, who was 13 and had recently acquired an adolescent's awareness of the comedy available in his parents, said, "Mama, when did you get that coat? I have never seen Papa wear it." "Your father gave it to me," Lena said, pouring coffee. "When? Before you were born." "Why?" "Because it was cold." "Why does he not get it back?" Lena looked at Cole. Cole looked at Eddie. "Because," Cole said, "it was always hers." Eddie looked at the coat and then at his father and then at his mother and then back at the coat, working through the logic of this, and then nodded in the way of someone who has decided to accept a thing even though the math is not entirely clear. The years layered themselves with the unhurried reliability of Kansas seasons. Clara went to college in 1902, to a women's college in Ohio that she had chosen because it was the best available for the field she had identified, which was mathematics, specifically the application of statistical methods to agricultural economics, which was a field that was barely a field yet but would become one, and Clara would be among the people who made it one. She wrote letters home every week, long, precise letters that Lena read aloud at the dinner table, and Cole read again privately in his office. Eddie, at 20, was effectively running the day-to-day operations of Whitaker and Webb, which Cole let happen by degrees and Thomas Webb encouraged, because Thomas had always been better at assessing potential than Cole was at accepting it. Eddie had his mother's authority and his father's steadiness and a humor that belonged entirely to himself, and the horses responded to him with a trust that was almost visible. In 1903, Cole turned 51, and Lena turned 43, and the homestead marked its 22nd year under their care. The house was not the same house it had been in 1881. It had grown and changed as they had grown and changed, additions and alterations that marked the different seasons of their life together as clearly as rings in a cut tree. The original kitchen was now part of a larger kitchen that was the heart of the house in the way that Lena had always said a kitchen should be. There were 3 sleeping rooms and a sitting room and Cole's office, and a room that had once been the children's shared room, and was now Clara's room when she came home and Eddie's room when he was not sleeping in the bunk room he had adopted when Thomas Webb's family moved to their own property. The coat still lived on its hook by the back door. It was old now, as coats go. Sheepskin holds up well with care, and Lena was constitutionally incapable of not caring for things properly. But the years had worn it soft and supple in a way that new things are not, and the smell of it was the accumulated smell of their life, wood smoke and horses and the herb garden and the particular smell of Kansas in every season. The buttons had been replaced twice. The lining had been restitched once. It was, unmistakably and permanently, hers. One evening in the autumn of 1903, Cole came in from the barn late, when the children were long out of the house, and it was just the 2 of them as it had been at the beginning. And Lena was at the kitchen table with her lamp and her account books, and she had the coat on over her dress because the evenings were getting cold and the fire had dropped. He stood in the doorway watching her for a moment before she knew he was there. She was 60% gray at the temples and had been for 3 years, and she had decided against fighting this with the thoroughness she brought to all her decisions, and it looked on her the way everything looked on her, like a choice made with intention. Her hands on the account books were the hands he had known for 24 years, expressive and competent, the same hands that had pulled his coat around herself in a blizzard, that had taken his face between them on the day he came back from Missouri, that had held their children for the first time. She looked up and saw him in the doorway. "You are late," she said. "The gray mare had trouble settling," he said. "She is fine now." "Come in," she said. "There is supper on the back of the stove." He came in and sat down at the table across from her. He did not go to the stove yet. She looked at him across the lamp. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking." She looked back at him. "You have been looking at me for 24 years. "I know it," he said. And I have not finished yet," he said. "Not even close." She regarded him with the look she had given him since approximately 1880, the one that was trying to contain something too large for the container, and then she looked back at her books. "Go and eat your supper," she said. "You are embarrassing yourself." "Probably," he said, and went to the stove, and he was smiling so broadly that even the back of his head was probably visible from across the kitchen. Clara came home for Christmas of 1903, on the train from Ohio, arriving at the Caldwell station with a trunk of books and a sharpness in her eyes that suggested college had given her considerably more than mathematics, which was expected. She was 22 years old and was, in the assessment of everyone who encountered her, formidable. She had her mother's precision and her father's patience, and she had developed on top of these things a quality of intellectual confidence that was all her own, and it was magnificent and occasionally overwhelming to be in the same room with it. She sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours the first night home, talking to Lena about things Cole could follow but not contribute to, mathematical concepts and their applications, and what was being done in Ohio and what she intended to do afterward. And Cole sat with his coffee and listened to his wife and his daughter talk and felt the specific, complete happiness of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. Eddie came in from the barn and got his supper and sat down and listened to his sister for about 15 minutes and then said, "Do you want to hear about the gray mare?" Clara looked at him. "Is the gray mare currently doing something mathematically interesting?" "She is pregnant," Eddie said. "Due in February." "That is one of the more straightforward equations," Clara said, but she was smiling, because underneath the formidability she loved her brother with a warmth that never required announcement. The Christmas of 1903 was one of those occasions that arrange themselves into memory with a completeness that other days do not achieve. The 4 of them, Cole and Lena and Eddie and Clara, around the table that had been through 22 years of meals, in the kitchen that Lena had finally made exactly what she had described in the Holt's garden in the summer of 1880, the lamp light and the smell of food, and the sound of their 4 specific voices in conversation. After dinner, after the dishes were done, the family sat in the sitting room and Eddie asked, because he had been thinking about it, how his parents had met. He knew the general outline but had never heard the full account, and Clara wanted to hear it too, from the beginning. So Cole told it. He told it straight, from the moment he pushed out of the drover's rest into the blizzard looking for his horse, to the sight of her at the corner of the livery, to the coat coming off his back before he had consciously decided to move. Lena sat in her chair and listened to him tell it with the expression of someone hearing a story about 2 people she knows very well and being moved by it anyway. "You just gave her the coat?" Eddie asked. "Without thinking about it," Cole said. "And you never got it back?" Cole looked at Lena. Lena looked at Cole. "Never," he said. "Do you want it back?" Clara asked with the particular precision of someone who is checking whether a story contains the correct logic. Cole thought about this as if it were a real question, which from Clara it always was. He looked at his wife in her chair, the coat on the hook by the back door where it had lived for 22 years, the life they had built between the blizzard and this lamplight. "No," he said. "I do not want it back." Lena smiled. Not just around her eyes, the full thing. "Good," she said. "Because you are not getting it." Outside the house, Kansas was as quiet as it ever got, which was not very, because the wind never quite stopped. But on this particular December night it was a gentle sound, a moving through rather than a tearing through, and the stars were out in the specific clarity that follows cold weather. And somewhere to the south, probably, a coyote was having opinions about the night that it was sharing with anyone who would listen. Inside, the lamp burned. The fire settled. 4 people sat in the room they had all come to from different directions, and at different times, held together by the specific combination of blood and choice and love that makes a family, and the coat hung on its hook by the back door, not as a relic but as a living thing, still used, still needed, still carrying the warmth of the person who had never given it back and never would. In the spring of 1904, the gray mare had her foal, a fine strong bay colt that Eddie called Eduardo after the grandfather he had never met, which made Lena press her lips together very tight for a moment and then walk into the barn to see the foal with her coat on her shoulders and her eyes bright in the dim barn light. Cole followed her in and stood beside her at the stall door. "Good name," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. The foal was on his feet, leggy and uncertain and entirely perfect, nosing at his mother with the focused appetite of new life. Cole put his arm around Lena's shoulders, and she leaned into him, and the barn was warm with animal heat, and the smell of hay and the sound of the mare settling, and outside the Kansas spring was doing what it always did, coming in with color and wind and the enormous sky going blue over the prairie, over the homestead, over the house and the garden and the hook by the back door, and the coat that had started everything and ended nothing, because the best stories do not end so much as they deepen, becoming more fully themselves with every season that passes through them. He had given her his coat in a blizzard without thinking. She had never let him take it back. And in between those 2 facts, in the space they created and held open between them, lived 24 years of a life that was full in every sense of the word, full of love and argument and work and children and horses and gardens and hard winters and good summers, and the particular, daily, renewable grace of choosing the same person across all the different versions of yourself you become as time moves through you. The coat was hers. It had always been hers. He had known it on that December night, before he knew anything else about her, in the moment before thought, in the instinct that is more reliable than reason because it comes from the part of you that is already finished calculating and has reached its conclusion. He had handed her the coat. She had kept it. He had kept everything else.